This made me nervous. Then the horrible thought struck me. Suppose the staff had finally conceded that I knew what I was doing.
Good evening and welcome to Jim and Parker's excellent podcast.
Excellent.
And tonight we're in for a treat because Parker and I are going to be reviewing Walt Disney's Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious masterpiece, Mary Poppins. This film celebrates its 60th anniversary today, on August 27th, and we are here to bask in the glory of all that is Mary Poppins. We've both grown up with this film. This film is a special film in many respects, and I'm just going to tip my hat a little early here. This is my all-time favorite film, alongside David Lean's The Bridge on the River Kwai. So I am quite excited about this one. Parker, how about you?
Oh, very excited. I mean, this is just a movie that I think just like is something that every kid probably watched in their childhood. I remember the old VHS tape at my old house, and it's timeless. It's one of those movies that just has a superior power to it. And it really was not only revolutionary for its time, but its long-lasting effect is absolutely incredible.
Absolutely. You know, this was one of Walt's true passion projects. In 1938, after the smashing success of Snow White, he went on a spending spree, picking up the rights to all sorts of books. But there was one book that his daughters absolutely loved and begged him to make that he just couldn't quite get. And it was Mary Poppins by P.L. Travers, because Mrs. Travers was very hesitant about giving up the rights to Walt Disney, considering she didn't like Walt Disney at all. She generally didn't like book adaptations at that time, which in some cases is quite fair. But in this case, she thought he was going to absolutely massacre it. But over the years and different times, Walt would go back, and eventually in 1961, P.L. Travers relinquished the rights. And after a very fraught story conference with her and the creative team, she eventually relented to allow the film to be made. Now, if it sounds like I'm glossing over this a little bit, it's actually because Parker and I, back in 2020, season one of our show, actually discussed this with our dear friend Natasha, because this was depicted in the movie Saving Mr. Banks. So we'll put a link to that episode in the description, and or just go check out the channel. We got lots of great stuff on here. Gosh,
A shameless plug there.
4 years ago we talked about that movie. Can you believe it?
God, I feel old, Jim. I can't believe that was 4 years ago. Wow. Yeah.
It's Sir,
Uh,
it's Sir Simon and Garfunkel here.
Seriously.
So, but yet after that contentious bit with P.L. Travers is when the gears really started to get going, because not only did he hire two of his top writers, who were Don DeGrady and Bill Walsh, he also first hired the Sherman brothers, Richard M. Sherman and Robert B. Sherman, the most legendary songwriting team of their time, and still one of the most influential songwriting teams of all. And in our pregame, we were clarifying that this was what is definitely called an integrated musical, which is it has many, many songs throughout the film. Definitely, you have showstoppers, but what they really clued into, and which is why I think this movie really does stand out, is the songs that aren't the showstoppers, the ones that carry the story along. Because as many songwriters could possibly tell you, songwriting helps people get over really boring kinds of exposition.
Hmm.
And what did you think, like, in the first couple minutes revisiting the movie again, like just how many songs there are even before Mary Poppins shows up?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely, you said, it helps carry the story. And I think it's even the non like as memorable songs are still amazing songs. Like the Suffragette song, like right in the beginning of the movie is a perfect example of that. And
Yeah.
it helps to kind of like give you an idea of where the characters are coming from, what their motivations are. And it kind of just like gets you connected to the story a lot faster and in an engaging way instead of just like a lot of exposition, exposition, exposition. It's really just like kind of fun because it snaps you into that moment quickly. And I think that one is one that definitely sticks out to me because I was like, huh, it's like a really fun, catchy song and everything.
Yeah.
And I think also being that it's an integrated musical where you will have the musical portions and then just the normal kind of like regular film portions. it does kind of help move it forward. And I also kind of prefer this way. I really don't like musicals where the entire duration is like one musical, kind of like Hamilton. Great musical, really great production quality, and I absolutely like it. But that type of musical isn't my favorite. I prefer this style where the musical elements help build on top of the story. And I think that this is the masterclass. I think if you want an example of how to go and do it, this is it. There's nothing better than this.
Yeah, and what's wonderful too is the Sherman brothers. Uh, Richard Sherman is definitely fresh in my mind. He sadly passed in June. You know, into his 90s. Such a long career and a long career with his brother. Uh, they had this knack for not only writing the cleverest lyrics and words that are tongue twisters like supercal, uh, but they had what was incredible was that they weren't really raised as filmmakers. They were raised by their father, who was himself a popular songwriter in the 30s. But they understood that you have to convey a story through your song, as catchy and witty as it can be. There has to be something going through,
Mhm.
which led to Walt finally deciding to put them on staff. They had done a couple of songs for like title sequences in the first few years that they were at the studio, so not really anything of much importance. But when they came up with their song concepts, one song definitely stood out, and we're going to be revisiting this throughout the podcast, which is they came up with "Feed the Birds," which uh, such a gorgeous song, one that actually moved Walt to tears, which was quite rare to do because Walt was very stingy with praise. He would, or any compliment he would give was, "That'll work." Whereas he had tears in his eyes. He was looking out the window at the studio and he says, "You fellas really like to work." And they said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Disney." He says, "Would you like to work for me?" And so he made them his staff songwriters. And little touches of Disney magic throughout this production was he gave them a copy of the book and sent them home and said, "Okay, read this and tell me what you think." This wasn't just like a pleasure thing. He was basically coding as find story material. And so they did. And they came back and they had underlined the chapters in crayon. And to their great delight, Walt pulled out his older copy of the book. He had the exact same chapters circled. So this was the serendipity of this movie, just behind this, from a behind the scenes standpoint, was everything. The stars were kind of aligning for this movie. Uh, they just seem to really have, you know, the frequency of the story, what the theme of the story is, and of course that just gave great inspiration to to Don DeGrady and Bill Walsh to just take all the good things about the books and embellish and expand. That you really have a screenplay that's worthy of some of the great films of all, even though it's based on a book and that could be very episodic. I think it was Bill Walsh who really snapped the script into shape compared to what it had been with Travers during those story sessions. That this is the theme of the movie. It's the parents and the children need to reconnect, and Mary Poppins does not come in randomly, but she comes in to kind of help fix the family. And once they're repaired at the very end, she flies away just as she does in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So kind of with that then, I think like a good place for us really to kind of start is really kind of the elements that make Mary Poppins incredible. And I think there's a few there's like three kind of main categories that really stand out to me just initially. Number one is the animation, which is at the time was revolutionary, even to this day, still looks absolutely incredible.
Yes, it
Second,
is.
as we've already touched on a little bit, is the music and the soundtrack and all of that. And
Yep.
then three, you got to have the powerhouse that is Julie Andrews, and then also Dick Van Dyke as well, like the casting and everything as well.
Absolutely. And the casting of this movie, like you said, we have the incredible and incomparable Julie Andrews and Dick Van Dyke, but we also have some really marvelous character actors that fill out the rest of the cast. You have the very prim and understated David Tomlinson as Mr. Banks, and you also have the effervescent Glynis Johns as Mrs. Banks, who sadly passed back in January. it's for the 60th anniversary, those two losses are very hard for Poppins fans, and losing Richard and losing Glynis, but we still have this movie to kind of smile and get us through it because it's just like they just brought such wit and energy, and even the children played by Karen Detrice and Matthew Garber. I love the subversion of the story where at the beginning of the film they're built up as unruly monsters, like they run away from Katie Nana. They that this isn't the first time it's happened during that week. It's like the fourth time, according to Katie Nana. Uh, but they're actually very sweet children. They just really want their parents' attention, and so it's not really kind of like they're bad kids. They're just kind of acting out and hopefully bringing their parents together, which isn't going to work because they're distracted with their own things. The father's a workaholic, and Mrs. Banks is a suffragette, so she's always with Emily Pankhurst's group, kind of doing all these things. That was the genius of what Walsh and DeGrady came up with, was giving all these characters that dimension. Is that, like I was saying before, it gives the motivation of a story, and it leads to a very good payoff at the end. But it wouldn't have worked if the cast hadn't been as great as it is, and even Dick Van Dyke with it is time to address this.
Yeah,
It
probably.
is from a technical standpoint. Yes, it is a very bad Cockney accent. He misstresses words. Sometimes it just sounds very American. It's not there at all.
So I have a confession to make about this. Um, Basically, like I knew who Dick Van Dyke is. I know there's the Dick Van Dyke Show and everything, which was way before our time, obviously, because we don't have gray hair. But when I heard that, I thought that was Dick Van Dyke's voice. I didn't
Right.
know anything else. And then later on in life, as we were like, oh, like the Dick Van like Dyke voice on, I'm like, isn't that just his voice? They're like, no, it's not. And then I realized the guy's from Missouri. Like he's an American. I'm like, oh, I thought he was like from it, like he had like some like weird speech impediment thing or whatever. And so I totally thought that was it. And so I didn't really realize like this whole thing around the Cockney accent and like all of like the hidden jokes about it because like there's a lot of movies that will like make fun of this and everything, and I didn't in
Yeah.
like very subtle ways, and I didn't realize it until much, much later on.
I kind of
Uh,
I kind of got a clue because I also grew up with Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, in which it's also set in England, and yet there's no attempt at an English accent, which I think was definitely by choice because he got the message after Mary Poppins, like, don't ever do that again.
yeah,
Uh,
seriously.
it's funny that the British say it's the worst accent in movie history, which I think there's a lot worse than that. But
Yeah, there's some. I was reading. There's like some lists out there where they have this ranked as second, and the
yeah,
number one worst is
I,
Sean Connery in The
the
Untouchables.
Untouchables, yeah,
Which is funny because he won an Academy Award. Which let's go.
yeah,
But
and
yeah,
nobody,
no,
yeah, nobody seems to harp on it as much as Van Dyke's. But I, it, you know, I was thinking about this the other day. Is I could care less if it's a bad accent because right from the minute you see him, he's smiling, he's charming, he's fun, very soulful kind of character that you almost kind of, I know this is the wrong phrase, but you almost become ear blind to the accent after a certain, you don't care after a while. It's just like, okay, that's just how he talks. So cool. Because like you said, you love spending time with him, and he's such a wonderful dancer and a wonderful singer. He's just this ray of light that
yeah.
you just I can never say a bad thing about Dick Van Dyke. I never could. Midwestern boy, uh, just just one of those souls that everybody seems to love, and he always brought his best no matter what project it was. And this movie is no exception. And Bert is a composite character from several characters in the Poppins books and it was a Walt invention. He thought, there has to be something going on with some of these other characters. So he made them this jack of all trades.
Mhm.
Obviously he's a poor guy living in the street, but every day he has a different job and he's just bringing his all to it, as a screever and as a chimney sweep. He just loves life, and it complements Mary Poppins perfectly in this case. So before we get on to the next, I have video evidence now of an interview with David Tomlinson on Terry Wogan's British talk show, where he confirmed that Walt had kind of asked him to check on Dick Van Dyke a couple days into filming. He's like, is it good enough? And Tomlinson said, I'll play a clip here.
Anyway, and Walt said, what do you think? And I said, I think he's doing very well.
He didn't mind it. And obviously Julie and Tony Walton and Robert Stevenson, all the Brits on the set didn't really pull him aside to say like, hey, buddy, you're not doing it right here. So
yeah, and it's not for lack of trying either. Not because in my half-assed internet research, as I usually do for all of these, he had an accent coach and a language coach that he worked with. It just turns out that it wasn't a good one, and that he didn't even know like the accent. So it's not like Dick Van Dyke was like knew it was bad and was going on with it. He was like he didn't know any better, and he was trying and everything. And then at that point, like you're saying, it's like you're kind of already in there. You can't like delay for another, exactly. 3 or months and all that. Yeah. So it's kind of like I feel like people shit on Dick Van Dyke a lot for this, but it's like you're making him seem to be like just some like ignorant like American or something who like was like it's just like what a British accent is. It's like that's not necessarily true. There's a little more minutia to it than that.
Exactly. The hatred is completely overblown at this point. And even what I'll end this with that. Some British actors have said, it's probably the worst Cockney we've ever heard, but they still love Dick Van Dyke. They still go like, I love you. It's just like, but it's okay. We still love you. So at least
because all the other parts of like his acting is great. The work he did in the musical numbers, fantastic. He steps in line. Like I think there are some ones where he's a better dancer than Julie Andrews. Like he's like snappy with it.
Yeah, and definitely when we talk about the music and numbers, he is not a trained dancer or singer at all. He's trained in mime, but not as a dancer, and yet he's doing all those things. And like I said, we'll talk about it a little later. But what really set this movie up for its truest success, like I said, all the stars were starting to line up. But a chance viewing of the Ed Sullivan Show, an excerpt from the musical Camelot, which came out in late 1961, early 1962, featured Julie Andrews singing with Richard Burton, What Do the Simple Folk Do? And it's a charming song from Camelot. And all the creative staff begged Walt to go see her in Camelot. And he did. He went to New York and he saw her and instantly was smitten. And he offered her the movie backstage. And what's kind of funny, she says, I would love to, except I'm pregnant. And he says, don't worry, we're going to delay it. You can, have the baby, have a little time, and then we'll start up. And she was very grateful for that. And more serendipity. Tony Walton, who was her husband at the time, was in the room. And Walt says, what do you do, young man? He says, I'm a set designer and I design costumes. And he says, bring your portfolio. And that was his first movie as well as Julie's first film. Because
so wild to believe. This exactly. Is first freaking film, and like it's just incredible, like in the day and age of like the golden era of Hollywood where these sorts of things that happen. Or like Audrey Hepburn, like kind of like another example of that. Her first few films were knockouts, and she was incredible with like very little training as well. And not to say that Julian just didn't have training, because obviously she'd been on Broadway and everything and absolutely earned her stripes. But it seems just incredible that like nowadays for something like that, it's so rare. Whereas back then, like it could happen, like you could be in one of like an all-time amazing like top 100 film and it'd be like your third acting gig. That just doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, and it's more serendipity here, Parker. You mentioned Audrey Hepburn because Julie Andrews became a more or less household name through acting in My Fair Lady on Broadway. And Warner Brothers had just purchased the film rights for an astronomical sum of money. And several people in the boardroom and George Cukor, who was attached to direct the movie, started saying, okay, maybe we should get Julie Andrews out here and audition her. And Jack Warner said, absolutely not. He says she is not a movie star. She will not bring in any money. We're going with a star. And so he went with Audrey Hepburn for Eliza Doolittle. And to this, I dislike Jack Warner for many reasons. You know, he was a fantastic, he made Warner Brothers what it is, obviously, and he produced some great films. I have personal gripes with his personality and several of the things he pulled. But this one, it's one of those things where I just have to point and laugh at him and say, you let this incredible woman slip through your grasp. And it wound up competing with My Fair Lady at the box office and at the Oscars. It's Julie won the Academy Award for Mary Poppins, and Hepburn didn't even
It was
get
a
nominated.
very controversial Oscar moment too, because there were a lot of people that thought that Audrey Hepburn should have won for My Fair Lady, but because of Mary Poppins and Julie Andrews not getting into My Fair Lady, that the Academy was like swayed to give it to her as like not like a cop, because she definitely earned the nomination, earned the Oscar too, in my opinion.
I one of my favorite performances here.
Yeah,
Uh,
but it's really interesting that like that kind of tie-in happened and everything, and like, yeah, not casting Julie Andrews My Fair Lady. That's got to be one of the biggest misses in like the last like 50
and
years.
what made that decision even worse was that Audrey was promised that she could sing all the songs.
Hmm. And she did sing all the songs in like all of it, in all the production and everything. Which she wasn't no Julie Andrews. She wasn't bad though.
Right. But then what really kind of soured people was after she was finished singing those parts, they told her, "Oh, you're going to be dubbed,"
It
which,
was like at the end of like production or the end of filming, if I remember, or sorry, not in production, end of filming.
yeah,
And she was really like hurt by that, which I would be too, of knowing she went through months of training to get ready for that film.
so that's why I think a lot of the Oscar voters, yes, probably thought like, okay, you have Julie Andrews who has a natural singing voice that could go so many octaves, and you cast a actress who you're just going to dub. People just thought, wait a second. It just read wrong, and it still reads wrong
Hmm.
when you look. But again, like you were just saying, when you look at Julie Andrews in this movie, the word iconic or superb or exceptional just don't even come close to what she achieved. She just lands right on her feet in Hollywood, her outstretched feet, just as Mary Poppins are in the book. She was very keen to have that.
Yep.
She just dominates every part she's in. All your eyes are on her. Her presence is absolutely incredible. She sings beautifully. She acts wonderfully. It's just one of those performances that just everybody knows, just like, Mary Poppins, and everybody can get behind her. And what I love too is that she's not as squeaky clean as a lot of people like to think, because a lot of people like to we'll see the poster where she has the big beautiful smile that she has. In the movie, she actually can be very strict and very stubborn, which
Hmm.
is very close to what P.L. Travers had put in the books. And she's a little vain as well. Like the first shot of her we see in the movie, she's got her little mirror and she's kind of powdering her face and just kind of looking in the mirror. And she does that throughout the movie. It's just, so it I think that kind of added depth to the character. It's just like, yes, she can give treats and sing songs for the children, but she's there for a purpose. And
Hmm.
if anybody tries to sway her away from it, she'll pull the reverse Uno and put it right back onto them. Particularly with her repartee with David Tomlinson as Mr. Banks is great, because he's very strict and stern, and he thinks, okay, I'm going to hire this woman, or I'm going to tell this woman how it is. She just flips it right around without ever really trying, and to the point where he's convinced, like, oh, I've done all this myself. It's a wonderful little character bit.
Yeah. And I
And
think a scene that encapsulates that perfectly is the scene where with Bert and the children, she goes to the friend's house and he's like floating up on the ceiling and everything. The children and Bert all get up there, and then she has to be very strict and stern and be like, no, come down right now. And
Yeah,
I think that scene kind of encapsulates it perfectly.
Also, let's be real here. Who doesn't love Edwin as Uncle Albert? Just one of the most lovable characters ever.
it actually ties in with Mr. Banks's story because he throughout the film he goes through the most change, and he
Hmm.
has to learn to kind of lighten up and pay attention to his children, which on a superficial level could be seen as a very kind of simple or trite kind of story, but the way they go about it and it seems very fresh. He has a line after the adventure in the chalk sequence. The kids are singing Supercal, and he's woken up. He's not in a very good mood, and his family said, and his wife says, "You always said you wanted a cheerful household." He says, "I'd like to make a differentiation between the word cheerful and just plain giddy irresponsibility." And that leads right
Oh
into
my.
the scene at Uncle Albert's, where they're literally floating about, laughing, telling jokes, and kicking the ceiling, and she's down on the ground, kind of saying like, "Check yourselves, like bring it down, guys." And eventually they do come down, which I didn't catch that until this viewing. I was just like, oh, interesting. Like I said, it it's not as two dimensional as people think. There's a lot of stuff kind of going under the surface,
Yeah.
and each adventure they go on, again, this ties into the moral is people kind of miss that. Oh, they go on these adventures and then suddenly an ending happens. It's like, no, that's not what happens. They learn things from these adventures and they pass it on to their father. He's really the first person they tell about.
Hmm.
It's like when they get back from Uncle Albert's, Michael tells him, I know a man with a wooden leg named Smith, and you know, what's the name of his other leg? But the father, he's so overwhelmed from work that he just doesn't hear it, or it seems like he doesn't. But then at the end, it turns out he was listening to them the whole time, which is a nice little twist. But as you were saying, speaking of the adventures, the first one is obviously when they jump into Bert's chalk drawing and they go into this hybrid of animation and live action, which they had done it a few times before at the studio, but not at this magnitude, and nor was it this seamless. And more serendipity from Disney. The person who created the process that allowed this to happen was none other than Ub Iwerks, who was the man who animated Mickey Mouse for Walt back in the 20s.
Hmm.
Actually, he came back and was kind of the technological fix-it man for Walt. He would solve all the complex problems, which is, this was the perfect showcase for the sodium vapor process, which was actually much better than blue screen, like leaps and bounds. And the camera is actually on display at the Walt Disney Museum here in San Francisco. So if you ever get a trip to the city, go check that place out. But just so charming, and the animation is the best it's looked in years because this was during a point where the animation wasn't really looking too good at the studio. They were using Xerox copiers to kind of speed things along, and it led to this kind of sickly, sketchy look. Whereas
Yeah.
this one, everything is very cleaned up. It looks exactly like it did in the Golden Age. And those penguins are just so fun and so freaking cute. I
Yeah.
love those. As soon as they come out, Richard Sherman plays that kazoo on the score. It's just I'm instantly laughing and I'm instantly charmed.
Hmm. Yeah. The animation was incredible. Like what they were doing, like it was revolutionary. This is 1964. This is even before the I mean, this is way before the advent of CGI, but like it was a combination of hand-drawn paintings and pictures and like sketches and live action. And to this day, it still looks incredible. It's iconic. Like that, like you're saying, that first scene in there with the penguins and in the chalk art, it's iconic to this day. If you show people a picture of that, they instantly know, yeah, it's Mary Poppins. They,
Yeah.
they they know it. It's that iconic.
Van Dyke, just doing this wonderful dance with the penguins, having to stretch out his pants so he could get the waddle right. I mean, that's just, again, more just fun stuff. And what I love about the old Disney movies with special effects, they're there to help tell the story, and yes, also to wow spectators, because it's in the book and it's in the screenplay. They jump into a chalk pavement picture. How else would you do that? Animation with a combination of partial live action sets so that it could blend. And that was just a wonderful way to show, like, it's almost like a dream, going
Yeah.
in. And again, Walt Disney being Walt Disney, originally it was for animated human waiters, and the story was being pitched to him, and he goes, "Wait a minute." He says, "Haven't waiters always reminded you guys of penguins?" And so everybody said, "They're penguins." I mean, that's just a wonderful little touch, and Walt was chock full of that. And even more so, like the merry-go-round horses coming off the merry-go-round, and they go bouncing through the countryside. It's just the imagination in this movie is off the charts. I'm charmed by it every time. It's inspiring, and I always send this to Sophia on her birthday, or even to some other people, is when Bert scoops up the flowers and gives them to Mary, and she goes in to smell them, and they transform into butterflies, and they just look with such wonder. That's what I love about this movie. It just generates imagination and wonder for me. Like,
Mhm.
just those little bits. And it'd be one thing if they were just little moments in the movie that, didn't have much, but the movie's so full of it.
Yeah.
It's and like, again, the dancing with the penguins, or even the little Irish sly fox that Bert rescues as he's run away from the dogs. As soon as he's up on the tail, he's like, "Come and face me, you dirty of a dodge." He's ready to go. Just the movie's brimming with personality like that. Uh,
It absolutely is. Yeah. Um, so I think we've touched on the animation, we've touched on the music a little bit, we've touched on the acting now.
yeah.
Kind of like a bit of a fun question. What's your favorite scene?
Oh gosh, without a blush, it's I I can't wait to talk about this. It's it's step in time. The
Mhm.
chimney sweep dance on the roof. When I was a kid, I was so all about that scene. Like, I would dance across my room. I'd be hopping on the couch. I'd be hopping off. I'd be bouncing on the wall, just like they do in the dance. And I just love that whole sequence because it really shows off two things. One is the incredible choreography by Mark Breo and Dee Dee Wood, who were husband and wife at the time. They were assistants to the legendary Michael Kidd, who choreographed many great movie musicals and Broadway shows. They went further than he did because the choreography in that scene is breathless. It is fast, it is relentless. There are barely any pauses, and yet these guys have the smiles on their faces. It looks like they're absolutely bursting with this happy sense of joy. It reminds me very much of Gene Kelly in Singing in the Rain when he's dancing through the
Really?
puddles and hanging on the streetlights. And second of all, is what this movie does wonderfully, and it's throughout the whole film, is the sense of this magical, dreamlike atmosphere that conjures up. Like, the sets of the chimneys look amazing. That's beautifully lit in this wonderful blue with the little warm lights coming through the windows with the smoke everywhere. And part of that too was also generated by special effects artist Peter Ellenshaw, who's absolutely one of my favorite artists of all. Did basically helped run the Disney special effects department. Treasure Island, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Darby O'Gill and the Little People. This guy was the top of his game, and the matte paintings that he created of London and the background when they go up that smoke steps, I'm getting tingles down my spine just thinking about this shot. Is when they go up the smoke steps, which again, so highly imaginative. They go to the top of the church steeple, and Bert says, "What do I tell you? It's the whole world at your feet." And it cuts to this sunset with St. Paul in the background and all these spires and all these homes. He says, "Who gets to see it but the birds, the stars, and the chimney sweeps?" The sun goes down and the little lights start flickering on, and that was holes in the paint scratched out so that they could put lights in back. It's such a simple trick, but it just creates such an indelible sense of place and magic. It's Disney magic. And of course, Step in Time is just so bloody fun, jumping over the roof. Dick Van Dyke and two chimney sweeps have to go from the top of one roof, run down, jump across a chasm, somersault, run up to another little platform, backwards somersault, and go into a big step. And like I said earlier, Dick Van Dyke was not a trained dancer. You wouldn't know just looking at this. Absolutely not. And of course, it's just a burst of energy after this very tense scene at the bank, and it leads into probably the most emotional scene of the movie.
Yep.
And that's my favorite right there. In fact, the scene following it is also up there. I love that whole sequence from when they shoot up the chimney to get up onto the roof and to when Mr. Banks gets to the bank. That's just for me the perfect stretch of the movie. What about you? Like, what was your?
You and I must be we are brothers from another mother because my answer is the exact same. Like it's the
Really?
yeah, absolutely. I remember like that's the scene besides the street art scene. That's the one I always remember as a kid. I loved it. It was always like so energetic, so much fun. And the playing of like all the different elements of light and shadows and everything. It was like it was so cool. And it was stuff that had been done before, but it was just perfectly mastered and they executed it perfectly. And yeah, like all like the dancing, the acrobatics and all of it was incredible. So yeah, that's my favorite scene. Like I can't say any better than you did. So yeah, I'm going to shut up about it because I don't want to even try and attempt to up that or even compete with what you just said.
Well, thank you. But like I said, it leads into a scene that, when you're a kid, you understand like something's going on, but maybe you don't quite understand. It's a very mature kind of adult scene. Is uh,
I literally just got like shivers up my spine as like you're talking. 'Cause I know exactly what you're talking about. Of
yeah.
like, sorry, I'm cutting you off, but I just want to say like
So
the second you said it, I'm like, it's yeah, and I think it's sorry, not to run you off, but it is the essence of this film, and I think why this film is so powerful beyond everything else. But it's like the spirit or the X factor of the film that is it. And I'm gonna let you continue on with it because you're absolutely on the right track with it.
So the following scene is before Step in Time happens. The Mr. Banks is more or less tricked into taking the children to his bank where he works, and they meet these decrepit old bankers. One of them, played by Dick Van Dyke in heavy makeup, who's actually grown into it just naturally, which is really strange, but also, fantastic makeup right there. But the children cause a scene because of Mr. Dawes Sr.'s treachery, and it causes a run on the bank, and Mr. Banks is in huge trouble, and he's been summoned back to answer for it. He's going to get fired. And he speaks with Bert in the living room, and Bert kind of levels with him about, hey, I understand what you're saying, and you're totally justified, but at the same time, think about your children because they miss you terribly, and they're going to grow up. So value what you have. And the children come down and give him the tuppence, which started all this. There's a close up of David Tomlinson that's like Oscar caliber acting. It's just that scene of, oh, everything just kind of comes home. And then he walks to the bank. And it's this deeply atmospheric night scene. There's no dialogue. He's just walking through the park. The fog is everywhere. And it's just one of those scenes. It calls back to Feed the Birds. Again, that song that was the through line of the picture. And I'm a little side tangent here. The scene of Feed the Birds where we see the bird woman played by Jane Darwell, who was a great character actress in her days. In fact, won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for The Grapes of Wrath. She played Ma Jode. One of my favorite performances.
Really?
Yes.
Wow, that's a great. I did not realize that.
That was her. And that performance in Grapes of Wrath, one of my absolute favorites, her and Henry Fonda both. Uh, it's implied in that song that she's always there, like almost like practically like she never leaves. And he decides to stop in, maybe perhaps give her the tuppence. She's not there. And the music swells to this Gregorian chant almost, like that swell from Feed the Birds. That scene like moves me so deeply to tears because it's just like that's kind of what the movie's about. And you could see in his face that he's starting to understand and things are processing. And it leads naturally to his redemption at the end, where he comes home and, as a sign of commitment to his children, he mends the broken kite, which leads to Let's Go Fly a Kite.
Also, a quick aside, I hate the criticism that Mrs. Banks supposedly gives up being a suffragette because she uses her suffragette ribbon to tie it to the kite to use as a tail. That's not what that is, guys. She's going to be a suffragette. She's just putting her own piece of the puzzle onto the kite. That's why they all go to fly it together. She's just recommitted herself to the family unit. She's not giving up being a suffragette. I just never got that criticism. I don't like it. This is what I think it is. Thanks very much.
The Sherman brothers' father, Al Sherman, would make them kites on weekends, out of butcher paper and sticks and strings. And he'd make up, and for all the kids in the neighborhood, it was a little hobby of his. That's why the song's in the movie. It's just, again, all these personal touches, everybody bringing everything that they love into it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you might agree with me is that scene, all those scenes together are really what Mary Poppins does best. It can be really fun and really inventive, but yet there's also something genuine happening underneath all the special effects and underneath all the jumpy and bright songs. There's just it really makes the movie special, is things like that. Like, no, it's, again, I know we're all kind of jumping around back and forth with this, but there's so many great things to talk about that we could be here all day. But there's one person I'd like to mention that doesn't really get the credit he deserves on this movie, and I've been waiting to talk about him for years, is the director of the movie, Robert Stevenson. He was a director who started out in the 30s in England and eventually found his way to Hollywood. And he directed a lot of very good movies, like a great adaptation of Jane Eyre with Orson Welles. Eventually made his way to Disney with Old Yeller. If anybody's seen Old Yeller, y'all know how good it is and what an emotional powerhouse that movie is. He quickly became Walt's most trusted director on the lot. If he felt like he had a picture of any kind of importance, he would give it to Robert Stevenson, because Stevenson could do anything. He could direct comedy. He could direct drama. He could direct, as evidenced by that, he could direct a musical. He could direct a special effects laden movie, and all of it came together under his very deft hand. He plays, as you were saying earlier, Parker, light and shadows. He could beautifully navigate a movie from light and charming to something a little more quiet, a little more thoughtful, and sometimes even a little dark. I mean, that shot of when Mr. Banks opens the conference room door and it's a black void with just the bankers in a spotlight, that is genuinely creepy. Like, even when I was a kid, I was like, God, I don't ever want to work at a bank if it's like this. It's
just so funny because I now work for a bank, of course, which is hilarious.
I know it's all exaggerated, but still, it was just that image.
We're not all scary. We're not all weird.
I know
some of them are, but not all of us.
But still, it's just people genuinely assume that Walt did everything, and yes, he had an incredible hand in this movie. He was there every day, contributing ideas. But Robert Stevenson was a great director, and people use a word to describe him that I genuinely despise, which is he was a journeyman director, that is I know what a journeyman director is. It's just people who come in, do it for the paycheck, just kind of sail through it, forget it. Stevenson was such a passionate man with such attention to detail that he brought his all to all of his projects. Even if the films were only average, which they were later after Walt passed away, you could still feel like there was a genuine hand behind this, like bringing it all to life and giving it energy, giving it pacing. And so with that leads into when the film came out, we weren't the only ones raving about this project. It had an incredible gala premiere at the Grauman's Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard, which I've frequented many times since I started traveling to LA. It was wonderful. It was star-studded. There were spotlights, there was decorations. It was truly a premiere that I wish I had a time machine. I would love to go back to see it. Critics fell over themselves for this movie. They couldn't find enough superlatives. And they felt it was the best film since Snow White back in 1937, or possibly even better than Snow White. I think it's better than Snow White.
Oh yeah.
And it's been declared. What do you think, Part? It was declared as Walt's magnum opus. The culmination of everything he had done up to that point with animation, pushing the boundaries of technology, live action. It really is the best work he ever did, and I love that he really genuinely was in there with this. Like I said, it was his baby for many years. He had promised his daughters that he would see it through, and it's just one of those that's why it's like the crown jewel for me in the Disney crown amongst many. But Walt was not a perfect man, but when he was really into the idea, when he was really into the nitty-gritties, like pushing it to be better, saying, I don't like this, or this will work, or something's there, make it better. He was one of those artistic leaders, and it just shows in this movie, like, it's a pin feather short of perfection, and he wanted it that way. So much so that for years, the Best Picture nomination completely eluded him. He was never considered good enough for that until this movie. The movie scored 13 Academy Award nominations, which was I think it was the most nominated movie that night at the Oscars. Went up against My Fair Lady, which I'm not that big of a fan of the My Fair Lady movie. I think there were a lot of things done wrong that kind of
interesting. That's going to be a fun discussion one day.
Great score, obviously, Lerner and Lowe, can't go wrong. But a lot of the writing, I feel like Audrey Hepburn was miscast. Obviously, I would have loved to have seen Julie. She pulls some of the scenes off well, but there's other things where just like she's a little out of her depth. But
yeah, she's Audrey Hepburn. I'm sorry, it's in my eyes, Audrey Hepburn.
I love Audrey Hepburn. I do.
Sorry. I get what you're saying, but I'm like, wrong. She's Audrey Hepburn. I'm sorry. Anyway.
But compared to the other films it was up against, Poppins was up against My Fair Lady. It was up against a wonderful movie with Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton called Beckett. Brilliant character piece, tour de force acting.
Mm-hmm.
Another film called Zorba the Greek, which I have not seen yet. I'll see it eventually. But it was also up against Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. So when you say like My Fair Lady beat Dr. Strangelove or Mary Poppins at the Oscars, I'm like, for me, it's just like, I didn't expect it to win everything. But the ones it did win were for visual effects, for Peter Ellen Shaw and his brilliant team. Won Best Original Score and Best Original Song for Chim Chim Cheree, which, I freaking love that song. A lot of people don't, and I just love it. More Dick Van Dyke, please. And it also won for Best Film Editing for Cotton Warburton, which the movie is exceptionally paced. And Step in Time really showed off how good an editor he was, just wonderfully cut. And as we mentioned earlier, Julie Andrews won the Academy Award for Best Actress, and rightly so for me. Rightly so, no question. And yes, she also agrees that the sentiment about her not being cast in My Fair Lady had a hand in it, but I just don't, it just hurts me to think that she discourages that win because of that. It's just like, well, no, you were so great in that movie. You deserved it. Like you earned it. And the next year she was in The Sound of Music. So her career was
Oh,
made. She
yeah,
was so
Sound of Music, one of my all-time favorite films.
yeah. And we also talked about that with our friend Sophia, back in 2021. One of my
Another shameless. All right, so Jim, we've gotten 2 shameless plugs now. If we get a third one, then we know we've gone too far.
yeah.
Jim, look.
Oh, bless me, bless my soul. It's Sophia Roger. We're delighted to see you, my dear.
Jim Parker, it is so good to see you. You know, a little bird told me that you were talking about one of my favorite films of all time. I could not resist.
Well, while you're here, Sophia, what are your thoughts about Mary Poppins? Like, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. So, one thing is for sure, Mary Poppins, I think, was the start of imagination for me as a kid and still carries on into adulthood. There's a true magic that they really dedicated themselves to with the special effects, with the costumes, with the props, with the lighting, with the sets, and let alone the actors themselves that really showed wonderfully over the years and is something that has still been a staple in my mind to this day. It is the reason I love film. It's the reason why I love film editing, and is the reason why this film I think is one of my favorites of all time. I also as well have a few little fun facts if we have a little bit of time. We're going to start right at the very beginning, where before Mary Poppins even lands. So you see the shot where you see all the nannies, kind of all the different faces waiting to be interviewed. If you actually look closely, some of them are men in drag, which is kind of an interesting little fact and is something that I cannot unsee watching this as an adult. But now, I want you to take a look next time you see this film. Another little fun fact that I really like about Mary Poppins is we're going to dive into Jolly Holiday. Now, this fact comes from Julie Andrews' memoir, Homework, and we're going to dive into the first line that she ever spoke in the entire film, and that was actually during Jolly Holiday, which is why I bring it up. So Dick Van Dyke says something along the lines of, oh, I'm not going to get this exactly, but something like, "You look lovely today, Mary Poppins," and she goes, "Do you really think so?" And apparently that line she was fretting about. It was one of those where not only that it was the first line that she was ever going to talk about in the movie, she also didn't have a lot of experience in film acting. Most of her experience actually came from theater, so she was so worried she was going to mess up. Also, she talks about how that turtle she was standing on in that scene in Jolly Holiday is actually an iron anvil. And she just happened to mention that as well in her memoir, and I just thought I'd share that as well. We're going to fast forward a little bit as well to A Spoonful of Sugar. Now, not only is this scene kind of fun because a lot of the scene's special effects were because the film was shot in reverse, but also that one little bird on Julie Andrews' finger when she's singing with it is actually one of Walt Disney's first audio animatronics. Not only that, but there was a professional whistler they had hired for this movie, and apparently he didn't do as very good of a job, or she, I actually can't remember the gender, he, she, them, but Julie Andrews was like, oh, I know how to whistle, and she gave it a try. They ended up keeping Julie Andrews' whistle. So that basically means she's kind of talking to herself, which I find to be kind of funny in a way. And then for Step in Time, Dick Van Dyke also mentioned in his memoir, My Lucky Life in and Out of Show Business, that he was kind of feeling as if he had to keep up a bit with the dancers, which is probably why it was one of the hardest numbers to shoot. He said that he was approaching his early 40s and the rest of the dancers were like 10 years younger, so he felt as if there was a bit of a pressure to keep up. But maybe I'm just a little bit biased, but I think he did a pretty good job. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. But we're also going to kind of tie it back to Julie Andrews. So Julie Andrews and Tony Walton were both aware that P.L. Travers and Walt Disney kind of butted heads when it came to the production of this film. So she really tried to keep the peace and promised P.L. Travers that she would write, and she would write to P.L. Travers and talk about kind of the positive experience that was going on the set, trying to keep it positive, try to keep it light, and kind of just try to be the middle ground. And that kind of doesn't really surprise me that Julie Andrews did that. She just overall seems like a very kind of genuine person. But I also have never met her in person, so I'm not really one to talk. But I just thought that was kind of a cool little tidbit. And then finally, I think another fact I have, I'm going to actually pull this from my phone because I want to make sure I say this correctly. So Dick Van Dyke talks about in his memoir, there have been only 2 times in his career where he had known that he had a chance to be involved in something special. So the first instance was the Dick Van Dyke Show, and the second instance is when he read the script for Mary Poppins. It seems as if there was this superstition that everyone knew that this was going to be something really special. And fast forward now 60 years, I think it still lives up to its reputation.
Absolutely. And like I said before, and in fact, Parker, you said something earlier that's inspired me to show you. So, like I said before, this is my favorite movie of all time. It meant so much to me. And when I was a youngster, I was watching this videotape. Still have my copy. And at the very end, normally
For those who may not know, this is a VHS tape. These are real. This is how we used to watch movies.
Little demonstration there for you.
It's like an ancient artifact nowadays. Oh my gosh.
Here is my Mary Poppins umbrella. Here's my Mary Poppins Barbie. Here's my Mary Poppins VHS.
Treated with love. But at the very end of it, one night it ran a little longer. And all of a sudden, there were clips of the movie, and then there was this mustachioed man in a black suit on something called Stage 4. And I looked at my dad, I said, "Who's that? He's not in the movie." And my dad and my mom go, "Oh, well, that's Walt Disney." I was like, and I proceeded to watch this featurette about the making of the movie. And instead of being a kid like, "Oh, it's sets, it's special effects, it's not real," for me, it was very much like, tell me more. Like I thought it was so cool. And when I learned about how Peter Ellen Shaw created London, like they never shot outside. It was all on a soundstage. It blew my mind when I was a kid. And I was like, I want to do that, you know? And it inspired me, along with The Bridge on the River Kwai, to want to be a filmmaker. And so obviously this movie is so near and dear to me. I love everything about it. It's just, as she said, Mary Poppins, practically perfect in every way. A clear-cut masterpiece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I know that we're probably coming to the end of this. I do want to get your thoughts though, Jim, because we've talked about Mary Poppins itself. We've talked about Saving Mr. Banks, which has been the tie-in of how the movie came to be about. Just to throw a wrinkle into this, what are your thoughts on the sequel that came out, almost like 50 or 60 years later, Mary Poppins Returns?
I'm kind of glad I got my thoughts about this movie out of the way, because when I heard that they were making a sequel, I was a little hot and cold about it. I was like, should you? But then I heard that Emily Blunt was to play Mary Poppins. I was like, okay, this sounds good. And Rob Marshall is a good director. I thought, okay, things are shaping up. But when I saw the trailers, I was like, all right, it's a little different, but screw it. I'll go in with an open mind. I was kind of digging what they were trying to do for the first 10 minutes. I was like, okay, this is interesting. I'd like to see what happens. They make 2 critical mistakes that keep me from loving it. One was they structured it so closely to the original film. Mary Poppins appears almost to the minute that she did in the original. Like if you watch the time codes, similar kind of story progression, it's almost to the minute. I was like, it reminded me of Force Awakens in the way where it's almost like they were kind of remaking the movie in a little bit of a way, if you know what I mean. That they
We're not going into the new trilogy of Star Wars.
no,
That's for another day.
my point is
I have not had a sufficient amount of whiskey in order to discuss those films.
right. But my point is that they match the beats to the original movie. So it almost kind of felt like, okay, well, okay, now we're gonna go into I Love to Laugh with Uncle Albert, only it's Meryl Streep and her house turns upside down. Or it's like, oh, Triple O Life Fantastic. Oh, we're going down into whatever it is, the sewer for the lamplighters to do a little song on their bikes. It's just like, oh, well, didn't we do that with the chimney sweeps up on the roof? So the familiarity of it for me was a little bit of a miscue.
Yeah.
The other one was what I loved about the original was even though Mr. Dawes Sr. is a very sneaky, kind of decrepit old man, he's not a villain. The bank really isn't a villain. They're just there. They're people doing their jobs. They have kind of led Mr. Banks in the wrong direction. And even in the end, when we see them flying kites along with the family, and even one of them's like super into it, like he's pulling the string like this, and the other one's like, oh, go over that way. It's believable. It's just like, yeah, these guys are, they're serious about what they do, but they're normal.
Yep.
The sequel, its Achilles heel was casting Colin Firth as a transparently evil banker. And it was just like, oh no. As soon as he does something in the movie, I'm not going to spoil it, but very early on, he does something. I go, oh, we're doing this.
Yeah.
And it leads to another dumb development in the story later on. It's like this big action sequence. It's just like, it didn't feel appropriate to me. So as much as I just went on gripes about that, the movie is nice. It's enjoyable. Emily Blunt was wonderful as Mary Poppins. I think she was perfectly cast. Lin-Manuel Miranda was interesting as Jack because he's kind of doing another kind of Bert. His accent I actually couldn't buy more than Van Dyke's, if you can believe it. But again,
yeah, I gotta get that.
Lin-Manuel
they were really getting Lin-Manuel Miranda like right off of like the Hamilton hype and everything, and it's like this feels kind of like we're just getting the guy because we know he's a musical star.
But he's an incredible talent, and
he is, yeah, absolutely. No knock to him at all, but I'm like, I feel like we're just kind of getting him because he's the guy everybody's associating with musicals right now, and we're just going to ride the popularity train. Like, yeah,
a little bit. But everybody else in the movie's wonderful, and it was such a joy to see Van Dyke come back again. To do his little soft shoe on the table. Just doing that little dance. In fact, one of the great moments I think in the last 10 years for Disney was when they were celebrating Disneyland's 60th anniversary in 2015. They did a little version of Step in Time on the Oscar stage at the Dolby Theater. But towards the end of the song, Derek Hugh backs up and they open the door and there's Dick Van Dyke. The room went ballistic. Like if you watch the clip, like I'll play a little bit of it here. They went ballistic and they bring him out, they link arms, and then all of a sudden, step in time.
it's incredible.
I love that. And I got that.
How old is Dick Van Dyke now? Is he almost in his 90s at this point?
I think he's 96 or 97, and he's still kicking it.
That's incredible.
He's just
honestly, that's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, he's just one of those people. And Julie Andrews as well has had a long, illustrious career. Did some great movies with her second husband, Blake Edwards. Our generation grew up with her not only as Mary Poppins, but as the Queen grandmother in the Princess Diaries films. Those movies I like. They're not really for me, but I liked watching them when I was a kid. And of course, seeing Julie Andrews was always wonderful. It's just, she too is just this wonderful ray of sunshine, this very quiet, kind of dignified happiness that I get from her. And again, that the movie itself, I'll end my what impact it has on me is whenever I'm desperately feeling sad or gloomy or desperate or small, I put the movie on because this movie is probably, if nothing else, the happiest movie you'll ever watch and the most positive movie you'll ever watch without it being sickening. A lot of other films have tried, like a lot of the movies knockoffs that came in the years afterwards, tried to do the same thing but came off as a little obnoxious. This one threaded the needle perfectly. Was it brings a smile all the time, and the fact that it still continues to make people happy and brings us closer to Walt and closer to all the people involved. It's just that's an incredible legacy. And the last thing I'll say before I'll let you take your thoughts is more serendipity and more Disney magic was Richard Sherman in 2001 was asked to help dedicate the partner statue at Disneyland. Walt holding Mickey's hand and pointing, in the plaza in front of the castle. And so he sang a couple of songs, from the theme park and some of the other films. And he sang Feed the Birds. And because Walt had asked him every Friday after filming Mary Poppins to come in, he and his brother, Bob, to come in and sing the song for him before they were allowed to go home. Because it's really one of Disney's anthems and was so close to him. As afterwards, they said, during Feed the Birds, one bird out of the clear blue sky flew over the piano and just flew off again. That's the power of this movie and the power of songwriting, storytelling. It is Disney at its very best. This is what Disney is for me. If anybody asks me to define it, it's just like watch Mary Poppins and you'll get it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I agree. Like you were saying, that this is like the masterclass of Disney. And if not this, what's better? What encompasses it better? And nothing else comes to mind. It's absolutely incredible. And what I think gives the film extra star power, and this is tying back into something I was talking a little bit about earlier, like when you're talking about the scene of father going back to the bank and everything, he passes by the bird lady and she's not there. And the heaviness of that.
Yeah.
That's something that it ties in with watching this film as an adult versus watching it as a kid. As a kid, it's wonderful, it's fun, it's magical and everything. But as an adult, that theme of like parenthood, but especially like fatherhood as well, and what it means to like be close to your children and to listen to them, understand them, it's really powerful. And that's the element of it. And it does, and like you said earlier, nobody in this film is a villain necessarily. There are people, there are institutions and all that, but it's everybody just trying to do their best. And yes, we make mistakes and everything. We fall short of expectations or what people want of us sometimes, but nobody's a villain. Nobody's like trying to hurt other people, which I think is what the sequel really misses out on. I think that's the big miss of it, besides some other things that were other decisions. But that's what it is, that this is a movie about it's learning and growing and, especially as like a father and as a parent and everything, which obviously was very important for P.L. Travers and her story and everything and her connection with her father. And I actually think that message really resonates a lot today. I think we've seen a bit of a renaissance within movies put together in the last like 10 years where family and especially like father or sorry, parent and child relationships, we're seeing a big resurgence of those thematic elements coming through. Like one example that I think is a really great example of that is like the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, especially the second one. That movie, that like the end of that can move me to tears a little bit because it is really powerful. And I think that that's what gives this movie its long-lasting power, is that You watch it as a kid and it's amazing. It's fun and magical. But when you watch it as an adult, it takes on a different meaning and a different message for you. And so I think that that's what really does it. And that's what makes it timeless, because literally, as we grew up with it, and now as we've grown older, and this is a film that I'm sure we'll show our children one day, that it's timeless because it grows with you. And even if you don't watch it for years or decades, when you come back to it, it reminds you that it's only your childhood, but it's a different feeling with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's just again the magic of Disney too, is when they really are on it with their story, is it's for everybody. It was for people like to say Disney's for kids. It's not. It's for the family. It's for everybody. And as you beautifully point just said, that when you're a kid you find one thing, but when you're an adult you find more. It's a richer experience, and that's what some of the great Disney movies of old did wonderfully, was
Mhm.
blend both so that everybody could enjoy it and have something to share and talk about and
Yeah.
pass on to their kids.
And even today, like I think the best example of that, well, this is Pixar technically, but they're under the Disney umbrella. The best example of that are the Inside Out movies.
Yes.
Because for kids, fun joke, but as like adults, oh God, talk about emotional damage being done. I am not afraid to say this, but in the first one, the ending and the climax of that movie, the only movie I know that can make me cry on command. It just like hits. It's bad. There's no other film that does it to me but
I,
that one.
I was weeping in the theater because I got to see it in a sneak. I was weeping, and my friend Katrine was like, "Are you okay?" And I go, "This is incredible." She goes, and she eventually, after the scene was done, she goes, "I'm crying too." So,
Mhm. And I
and
think that that's like exactly to your point, Jim, of like that is when Disney is at its best, is that it's not just for kids, it's adults. And they take on different meanings. And especially also, like I kind of like why Mary Poppins is so good. It grows with you over time.
yes, absolutely. I think that's the perfect I think that's the perfect way to end this, is a timeless masterpiece that continues to touch the hearts and minds of everybody who's either exposed to it when they're a youngster, like we were, or somebody coming in cold off the street. Maybe they'll also see the magic of Mary Poppins, the brilliance of Julie Andrews, the sing or hum a couple of the pristine songs. Just this movie is tuppence a bag. It didn't take much, but you know, just everybody throwing in their tuppence into this movie: Stevenson, Walsh, DeGrady, the Sherman brothers, the cast, the crew, Walt Disney himself. It's it's just wonderful. The Again, my favorite movie is simply the best.
Yeah.
And with that, I think it's time for us to open our umbrellas and take off into the Peter Ellen Shaw sunset. I certainly know I want to. I'd love to live in that painting. But thank you all for joining us, and happy 60th birthday to Mary Poppins. I'm Jim Crowley.
I'm Parker Glazner.
Goodbye, Sophia Roger. Don't stay away too long.
You know, you can say it backwards, which is Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, but that's going a bit too far, don't you?
That will be quite enough of that, thank you.